Okay, returning now after the kind of like open discussion part of the class, which I did not attempt to record, for a look at uh, interviewing, types of interviewing and techniques. Go ahead and put that up. Hopefully this headset will stretch. For anyone viewing afterward, blah, blah, blah. Next week, I'll be at a conference, so Philippa will be delivering a lecture on research ethics. I'm going to go ahead and, well, actually, you know what I need to do? If I'm going to clear the board, I need to grab an eraser. The headset, I really can't be walking around as much as I usually like to. Probably good practice, though. Okay, so I just spoke to Daryl, and we will see about maybe getting something like a lapel mic that's wireless, or a little like desk mic that actually will pick up well starting next week. So basically, there are 5 kinds of interviews. You know, interviews can be conducted a great many ways, but for purposes of style, there are structured interviews, semi-structured interviews, unstructured interviews, which are not the same as informal, and the 5th category, usually recognized as the focus group, which is very rarely used in an academic context. For academic purposes, usually you are either doing research based on interview results, in which case you'll probably be using a structured or semi-structured interview, or you're interviewing people for their specialist knowledge, which is usually an unstructured or informal interview. Not always. The big thing is both structured and semi-structured interviews use an interview guide. An interview guide is a comprehensive plan for the course of the entire interview. With a structured interview, everything is fixed. A researcher can create a structured interview and then have other people conduct the interviews and get good results. Well, that's There are generally 2 kinds of questions, again, to create simple functional categories, that an interview guide may have. There are open questions and closed questions. A closed question calls for a specific answer and leaves little or no room for the person to then expand upon that. Not necessarily as simple as yes or no, but a short answer that people should be able to answer in definitive terms unless they have some sort of problem with the question itself. Open questions ask people to expand and can be anywhere from the kind of question that invites people to say a few words to the kind that can potentially take over an entire interview depending on how it's being conducted. Structured interviews usually consist mostly of closed questions but they can also include open questions. A survey is basically a self-administered interview that is both structured and closed. Not that you can't actually have a space in a survey for people to write longer comments, but usually to be useful as a survey, you have to be able to quickly tabulate results from a finite list. So most surveys, not only do they consist mostly of closed questions, they consist of closed questions where a range of defined options are your only choices. So you can actually do a lot more with a live structured interview, but obviously you can't interview anywhere near as many people as you can reach with a survey. The census that just took place is exactly this. It is one giant survey and is going to be used by the government in basically the same way as any academic might use a survey to look at trends based on answers to closed questions, and then to see what policy decisions, how they might be affected by those answers, and how policy perhaps should be determined by some of those answers. Now, a semi-structured interview has an interview guide, but the guide is no longer an absolute set of commandments, you might say. It's no longer written in stone. You can diverge a little from the interview guide if you're conducting a semi-structured interview. Semi-structured interviews are also more often going to contain a large number of open questions. Open questions, and will provide you're going to have an interview guide with a comprehensive plan for the interview if you're conducting a semi-structured interview. However, you're going to provide some flexibility to see where things go. And a unstructured, oops, did I put these in the wrong place? Closed questions, more open questions. An unstructured interview is a formal scheduled interview but you have an interview plan instead of a guide. An interview plan is more like topics you want to get to, kinds of things you want to ask about. Journalistic interviews are often unstructured. They're still formal interviews. There's still thought that goes in, but the flow of the conversation is very important. Ethnographic studies make heavy use of unstructured interviews because getting people to feel comfortable talking about their culture and experiences is really important, and trying to kind of pin that down too much can cause people to become withdrawn or restrained. Informal interviews are often spontaneous. That is to say, they most often happen because there's a chance to interview someone. Informal interviews, if they are for scholarly purposes, you still need to be clear with the person that you are having an interview. That's important. But informal interviews are often free-ranging. Interviews of content matter specialists, like if I need to know more about neural networks and I go to talk to a computer scientist, an unstructured interview is often the best way to go in, but sometimes an informal approach is just as good. Among other things, a really casual approach with minimal kind of structure where you just let someone kind of talk and ask them follow-up questions based only on what they say can be a really good way to learn more about a subject you know almost nothing about. You don't want to go in with a plan that has nothing to do with their expertise. In sociological studies, informal interviews are sometimes conducted in a kind of person on the street format, where within a given context or venue, the interviewer will just look for people to talk to, be clear with them about what they're talking to them about and why, and then just see what those people have to say. For example, I think there was an interview component to the book on cosplay that Paul Montfort just put out. Interviews in that context are likely to be informal interviews taking place at conventions where there are cosplayers in costume. Just kind of saying, hey, do you have a moment to talk? But they could be more structured. It depends in part on what the interview is for. Now, with a structured interview or a semi-structured interview, you can do statistical analysis. Closed questions allow for the comparison of numbers and percentages. If you're doing anything beyond a fairly simple, straightforward, this percentage of respondents said X, you may need to actually consult with a statistician. AUT has statisticians on staff who you can arrange for time with for an approved research project. Now, if you're conducting the kind of interview or survey that you can do this kind of work with, it usually will require ethics approval. Under some circumstances, surveys where there is no traceability of who took the survey might not, but you should start by assuming that they will require ethics approval. In general, the only kind of interviewing that doesn't require approval is when you're talking to an expert in a field about their field. So if someone wants to come and interview me about writing for games, they don't need ethics approval. On the other hand, if someone is doing a study of working conditions in academia and they want to interview me for that, they would need to have ethics approval. This is something that Philippa will get into detail next week, but there's a form, it's the PGR, what? Well, the PGR1 is the form that's the approval for master's study. I think it's the PGR 9. It might be the PGR 9. I think it's the PGR 9 that is the ethics approval form. And it involves spelling out exactly what kind of study you want to do, what the value is, being very clear. For example, studies need to not put the people being studied in any kind of harm's way, which can be more subtle than the obvious. I mean, we're not talking about poke yourself in the hand with this rusty nail and see if it hurts. But in certain contexts, for example, asking people to participate in a study where identifiable information that could be upsetting to their local government is present is putting them in harm's way. Also, studies of minors are possible, but are subject to a lot of extra scrutiny. Generally speaking, such studies are not functionally possible for graduate work, at least not for master's work, because the amount of time to go through all the approvals required to study minors is too burdensome.
Is it under 18?
Yes. Yeah.
So with that case, I know for social media people who are like 16, 17, if I just wanted to interview them, hey, how did you get started? Is that ethics approval?
Okay. So if you're talking to people about who are on social media, about how they got started on social media, you probably actually don't need ethics approval, but it is something you'll need to talk over in detail with your advisor. Exactly what requires ethics approval can get muddy. So, like, if we go from my previous example of someone coming to talk to me about, you know, whether it's working conditions or games writing, if someone wants to interview me about teaching at the university level, but it's part of a large scale study where they're asking questions of a lot of different instructors, that might actually become something that require ethics approval.
Okay, so if it was like your, say you're interviewing like a 16-year-old who's starting a business online, that's
Right.
very innocent. But then if your whole thesis was about kids on social media, then that.
Yeah. The general rule call someone a content expert and thus not requiring ethics approval is you generally are conducting a one-off interview with them, and that you are only talking you're talking to experts to get information you need about their expertise, and not, for example, studying a whole group of people who are supposedly experts in a given thing, because then it's a sociological study. Again, you need to talk with your advisor, but I would say you'd be pretty safe in that context. Yeah.
Ethics approval required even if the interviewee is anonymous?
Okay. There are different contexts in which anonymous content can be studied without ethics approval, as long as it is presented in ways that cannot be traced back to the source. For example, publicly posted information online can be used without ethics approval if it's anonymized, meaning that sufficient measures are taken to avoid the identification of the people who posted it. Corpus linguistics, for example, rarely requires ethics approval because you're taking a whole lot of text by a whole lot of different people, and you're studying, and what you have as output are statistical results about publicly shared writings that no longer have any connection that anyone else can figure out to the original authors. On the other hand, there has been debate about just how far researchers have to go in order to avoid the identification of comments posted publicly online. And there was a lengthy discussion about this on the Internet Researchers Board. And the overall conclusion was that it's not enough to just remove names or usernames, because a distinctive quote can easily be searched. So, for cases like that, for something to be ethically appropriate at all, let alone without specific ethics approval. Well, okay, to be without a specific ethical release from the person who originally posted it, you would have to do something like paraphrase the content, even though that is somewhat dissatisfying, perhaps, from a scholarly perspective, where it would be better to say they say exactly this. And standards may continue to change, and better ways of evaluating how to balance the need for precision with the need for protection of people's identities will probably continue to be a topic of discussion.
I think that, sorry, just to keep
Yeah.
going on that topic. I think this might be a bit out there for your studies, but with I was thinking with the kind of role play thing, I like a very like I have friends who are exotic dancers and stuff like this, and they're very open being online who they are, and
Right.
some of them kind of do cam girl work while playing Twitch, like streaming their role play games, and they're very open about it like that. So
Generally called game streaming.
yeah, if you, for example, are interviewing someone who does work, like you are interviewing a stripper, and they are very
Right.
open about it. I know of a fellow this girl online, she does comics now. She's an activist, she's very open, and she posts pics from her job. Everyone in life knows she does it. She happily will make quotes and
Yeah.
touchy kind of thing. Where do you go about that if they don't want to be anonymous? They're happy to do direct quotes, and for them, they're of age, everything's legal that they do, but there's a bit of a taboo kind of behind it.
Okay. Scholars are never obligated to abide by social taboos. In a case like that, where someone is both doing game streaming, which is pretty mainstream, and camming, which is basically a form of sex work, at least in the broader definition thereof, stripping, you would want to be very clear with them about how they were comfortable being identified. In a case like that, someone might be very comfortable, for example, being identified by the professional name they use for that work, but not by their actual legal name. And frankly, even if they're comfortable having their legal name used, that's something a scholar would have to think about in terms of their responsibility. And I would say that while you don't need ethics approval to write a journalistic article about something like that, for an academic study, you probably would need ethics approval. In part because an academic study would almost certainly not be of just one person in that situation. I did see a talk at the last New Zealand Internet Researchers was it INZIF? By someone who researches sex work, and the stigma is still very strong. And basically looking at the conditions of sex workers of various sorts and how the online world has changed things for better and worse for people who do everything from cam work to work as prostitutes. What she said was basically that the biggest issue wasn't, I shouldn't really have that much of a problem in terms of issues like ethics from university, but she did have to deal with a lot of people's squeamishness in terms of talking about the subject at all.
And to show how easy it is to figure out who someone is, I know what you're talking about because I saw her talk
Right.
on camp.
Yeah. And, in that context, most of what we do, what scholars do, is public. So we have no right to privacy about that. But that just how easy it is to identify someone is significant. For example, there are some hate groups online active in different countries that will target scholars who are researching things they don't want researched, and then spread rumors or make up entire falsehood out of whole cloth falsehoods about them, try to get them fired. There are some people who've start receiving death threats by email and don't know why until they research what happened, and then it gets traced back to some particular hate group that didn't like either what they were looking at or their conclusions about it. There is nothing in the world that's entirely safe. That said, frankly, scholarship is not one of the most dangerous things one can engage in, at least not most of the time. So, yeah. Let's see. There's a link on Blackboard to this article. Wait, I don't have a projector going, do I? To an article about interview guides. Trying to think what I can extract really briefly.
What section is that one under, sorry?
There's a section on Blackboard under content about interviewing and field notes. It's actually, I think, near the bottom of the content sections. I need to restructure all of that.
Is it possible also for us to get the handbook on here?
Yes, I will. The short version is I need to make some modifications and upload it. But I think some of the primary takeaways there are that it's important to make the distinction between what you're researching in general and what you're actually interviewing someone about, and to get into the differences between what their perspectives are and what they do in many cases.
And are you covering how to approach someone for an interview?
There's some material on that on the Robert Wood Johnson website. That's an American nonprofit. The Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. That's referred to in two parts of the lesson on Blackboard. If you click on one of the links for the different kinds of interviewing, it'll take you to their website. The how varies. It's kind of contextual. Often the best way to figure out how to approach people for an interview is to talk to someone who is in their field or has their variety of experience, because there is not a whole lot in common between, for example, how you contact a celebrity for an interview and how you contact a software developer for an interview, and how you contact someone who may be from a particular culture where the norms of that culture are critical in terms of how you reach out for an interview. Now, for a lot of people, if you can find that someone has a web presence and has contact information online, frankly, that like your software developer falls into this category. Just sending a politely worded email explaining what you're doing, that you're a graduate student working on a degree, and why you want to interview them is often the best way. Just direct but polite and transparent.
How would you get around for example,
Right.
there's to use your baking online kind of analogy, you are going to do some research on people who advertise their cakes online.
Mm-hmm.
You go for ethics approval, then you contact them, and actually none of them want to talk. Can you contact them? Can you make inquiries as to whether it's
You can.
viable
Yeah.
source before requesting?
Yes, you don't need ethics approval to look into whether you can interview people. And the short of that is, if you have any concerns about whether you can find an audience to interview or sufficiently large group to do a survey with, etc., is you do look into that before submitting for ethics. You look over the ethics requirements to try and make sure that you're not violating ethics in the process. But it is the long and short of it is that doing that ahead of time is functionally necessary. But it's only functionally necessary when there's a real prospect of not finding enough people to talk to. So you need to think about what the size of the audience you are trying to reach is. So, for example, if you want to talk to a bunch of people who do 3D design, you don't need to worry about whether there'll be enough people who want to talk to you. If you want to talk to people who do 3D design at WETA, then you need to make sure that there'll be enough people who want to talk to you, because that's a much smaller pool.
Speaking of numbers,
Right.
of these 5 times,
Right.
Are there certain minimum numbers of interviewees?
Frankly, there aren't any hard and fast numbers. It really depends on the nature and scope of the project in question, which means that I can give you some answers here in terms of what's appropriate for a graduate thesis. So,
Because you wouldn't want to interview 2 people and say, well, findings show that 50% of...
right. Like if you're doing a survey, you want to be able to get at least dozens of people. That's a rough figure, and again, it depends on exactly what you're surveying them about. For interviews, for graduate work, frankly, In many cases, even less than half a dozen can be appropriate. It depends on what you're doing. But for interviews, in most cases, if you're doing any sort of interviewing for research purposes, again, not talking about interviewing content specialists, subject matter specialists, 3 is the minimum for a significant sample. And there are some pretty sharp limitations to what you can do based on interviewing 3 people. In a lot of cases, it's more desirable if you can interview, a dozen or more people. And if you're doing a survey and it's not graduate work, you would often want to try and get hundreds of responses.
And these interviews as well, do they all have to be in person, or can you be doing
Oh.
online?
You have to be clear in your research, in your writing, about how your interviews were conducted. But you do not have to conduct them in one particular way, and you do not have to conduct them all in the same way, though huge departures in how you conduct them could affect the perceived quality of your research.
New term today when I was reading this, the snowball sampling methodology to recruit participants.
Yes. And there are a lot of different ways to go about finding participants. And there are certain statistical sampling methods that are important for the biggest studies. But for example, for one current graduate student who is studying aspects of English learning in China, she obtained permission to conduct surveys of a class at a particular school. And by class, I think we're talking about multiple classes, but a course at a particular school. And that's somewhere in the ballpark of 100 respondents who constitute a cohort that can be sufficiently generalized for a master's thesis. That's appropriate for a master's thesis.
Something like SurveyMonkey and sending the link to 100 people, they all fill it in, that is sufficient.
Yeah, this is another thing you need to talk over the details of with your advisor. But to give you an example, one thing that often happens is there'll be graduate students who are conducting some sort of study or survey, and it'll go out, and their instructors will send out, or even they will send out, requests over an appropriate content area listserv. And for example, perhaps other instructors who are doing similar things go, okay, this class I have is appropriate for this. I'll see if I'll give it to them to fill out. What generally is not an appropriate sampling method would be, for example, to ask all your Facebook friends to complete the survey. It would only be a sufficient sampling method if what you were studying was either yourself or potentially in a autoethnographic mode using your Facebook network to look at people whose socioeconomic and cultural place is similar to your own. That's potentially valid in that case. But for example, if I were to conduct a survey that had to do with how much people play video games, how many hours, and what kind of games they play, it would generally not be appropriate for me to just send that to all of my friends on Facebook. If I'm trying to conduct a survey in general, it might be acceptable to include a Facebook posting and a Twitter about that. But then this is stuff I have to cover in my methods, in my scholarship, and other people will decide whether they consider that to be good data or not.
Would it be appropriate in this Facebook group, it's called Girls in Business, and if I put up a post and they say, can anyone please directly message me if they would like to be a part of my interview, and then I can
Yeah.
pick and choose whose business is appropriate for me and then send them a link? Would
Yes, that definitely works, especially since you're interviewing. You need to, and what you've got there, you've already got a pool of people who are connected by an appropriate connector, that is, in being involved in and or interested in this topic of women in business. Facebook content groups can actually be a good place to look for people to conduct surveys with, to interview or conduct surveys of.
But
Using, oh, sorry,
the snowball sampling would fit there too.
Yeah.
Say to them, and if there's anyone you know
Yeah.
is appropriate,
Yeah.
get them to contact them.
when it comes to a group that's very big though, I think there's a group called Dog Group, it's the most efficient dogs, it's great. There's about 500,000 members though.
Right.
So it's something like that. It's, you would have to use sort of like, hey, anyone who has a Pomeranian of this age group, please message me. That's where you would go because you need a bit more.
Yeah. And I mean, it would depend in part, again, on exactly the nature of your research. If what you are researching is people who post pictures of their dogs on social media, then everyone in that group is a perfect subject. But
Search will be so large, is that a problem?
it depends on the project. Frankly, you would have to, for example, for that example I gave, come up with a research question that makes looking into the group of people who post pictures of their dogs on social media worth researching. Which, okay, here's an example. Let's say in doing your review of literature, because background research you do can be incredibly helpful in terms of focusing your work, not just making sure you're not doing something that's already been done, but if you found some solid research on that suggests that one, people with pets live longer, healthier, and or happier lives. Note that longer is the most easily measurable of these. And that let's say a follow-up study that suggested that people's benefit from having pets actually depends on their degree of engagement with their pets, then going to this Facebook group could be completely appropriate, because these are all people who engage enough with their pets that they are sharing photos of their dogs on a regular basis. If that's the only place you go, you'd have to note that your study was a study of people who share pictures of their dogs, and not, for example, and you did not attempt to, for example, factor in the engagement and health benefits for people who share pictures of their iguanas or scorpions or other pets that are very different. That potentially could be valuable research. And sometimes a really big pool of people is advantageous because you're going to get more results. More results always increase statistical reliability once controlled for who you're sampling. That's important. So this is now, at this point, frankly, a study where probably you would need to at least have a brief consultation with a statistician who could tell you if asking these people in this group is actually going to provide appropriate data about health benefits for people who interact with their pets. Because they maybe go, well, for this, and this reason, that's just not sufficient. What you need to do is X, Y, and Z instead. But from my position, not being a statistician, that sounds reasonable to me.
How about surveys like with game, let's say you've got a Facebook group which is actually pointed on one certain game.
Uh-huh.
You're trying to do a research survey, but the thing about gamers is they tend to be very pathological, I would probably say, because their answers will never be reliable. You can't really take like 80 out of 5. You might take 2 people who actually give you appropriate answers.
Okay, so trying to account for the unreliability of a group you're surveying, that's a really complex problem that may require a combination of significant research in psychology and extensive work with a statistician. So yeah, if you have a group of people you're thinking about surveying, and you are surveying them to see what they say, that's fine. You're still, they can all be liars, and you can say that this is what this group of gamers said, and then go on to note that, however, despite the fact that all 100 respondents claimed they had unlocked all the Steam achievements for this award, there is still one Steam achievement that no one has unlocked on Steam. So that is valid. But if what you're trying to do is extract from surveys something that resembles how honest people are, that's a huge mess. If you want to deal with people's dishonesty, you frankly almost have to deal with a much smaller sample and a different set of techniques.
You probably have to do like a closed questions on your surveys so to ensure that they can't really.
And frankly, like, so if I was looking into whether game streamers exaggerate their own accomplishments, what I would do is more of a close reading of first several samples from one big name, and then depending on the scope of the study, go on to other people. And I would then note that there was an average. I might then wind up having some statistical data, like there was an average of one flat-out factual error, right? Because factual errors are things you can quantify. So many factual errors per minute in this particular YouTuber's stream of an average over so many videos. If I wanted to attempt to establish that that person was intentionally dishonest, I would need to be looking really closely at exactly what they said in multiple different contexts and look for them to be contradicting themselves. And even then, that is more likely to be appropriate as a journalistic expose of a fraud than as an academic study, simply because of the difficulty of, you can say for an academic study that the person contradicts themselves. It's much more difficult to say that that means that they are lying. They might be forgetful. They might be not realizing they're doing it. They might have some sort of perspective in which lying is perspective or pathology in which lying is too simple a word for an appropriate academic study. So maybe, for example, an academic study might look at whether clinical narcissism is more common in a certain population. And that requires a lot of very specific research, because then you are talking about a definition of a state of mental health that cannot categorically be defined without a therapist's interview of a particular person. So, but there are other ways you could approach these issues, just pointing out how complicated it can get. Let's see. A much simpler thing you could do in a moderately similar vein would be to look at a bunch of streamers' videos, transcribe exactly what they say, and talk about not the streamer, but the streams, the contents of the videos, without attempting to draw conclusions about the authors, the creators. Because that you can do on a purely textual basis. Whether it's analyzing, doing, for example, corpus linguistics about the kind of language they use, or doing a close reading and going, this text is inconsistent and contains all of these racist references. I can totally do that. I can go and create transcripts of a bunch of streamers' stuff, look through what the words are, and pay attention to things like what images accompanied them, tone of voice, etc., and say that this video and this language contains racist elements. It is more problematic for scholarship, even if it can be noted as, even if everyone's going to agree from reading my article that I'm making the case that the streamer is racist. It's more difficult for scholarship to say that flat out because the creator and the text are never one and the same. But that's itself a bit of academic theory. It's different depending, which can also vary depending on what kind of audience or group you're looking at. For example, you can always assume about people things that they say about themselves. Sometimes it's a problem to do so. They might be lying. But if someone's conducting a study of language used on social media by white supremacists, if their criteria is that people self-identify as white supremacists or identify with or associate with groups that are identified by legal authorities as white supremacist groups, then you can say this is what white supremacists say online. Because you're not making the judgment that they're white supremacists, you're using clear criteria that you spell out in your study that they are.
How would you, say, if you're studying like common terminology, say gamers use like in games and compare them
Right.
like to people who say, I think you probably heard the term tilted, like people who get very upset over the games and
Right.
how their reactions are.
Well, self-identification is a good place to start. If people say, I'm this kind of gamer, or use certain phrases that describe a type, then you can group them in, especially if what you're doing is anonymized, so you're not picking out some person. Yeah. Another thing you can do, for purposes of research, you can create definitions and clearly state them. For example, for this research, I am looking at the behavior of serious gamers on Twitch. My definition of a serious gamer or a committed gamer is they spend at least X hours a week streaming. Now, that definition you've offered is actually arbitrary, but you've provided it clearly in so many words, and as long as people find that to be an acceptable definition, your research is valid. Sometimes it is much better to provide such a definition than to attempt to establish nature. So, for example, in comic studies, one of the places I have some background, there are some studies that say, okay, I'm going to talk about newspaper strips, and the newspaper strips I'm going to talk about meet these criteria. They're just providing a definition for their work. Other people go and say, comics are, and then list certain traits, and say anything that doesn't possess these traits is not a comic. That's much more of a problem, because they are attempting to say that there's that things that don't have those traits or don't have those combinations of traits shouldn't be considered by anyone to be a comic. They're making a comic book or a newspaper strip. They're making a very different claim there.
Isn't that what's happening like with cosplayers, people going on their Facebook pages and then writing first like saying you're not a true gamer or you're not a true
Yeah.
comic because they don't fit their traits of like a true comic or a true gamer.
Right. That sort of like fake geek girl, fake cosplayer, fake whatever it is exactly the kind of thinking academics should avoid. It is, I have a definition, and that definition is a universal truth. As an academic, it's much better to go, I'm using this definition, and if possible, it's great to explain why you're using a definition, but that it is a definition for the purpose of research, perhaps based on previous studies by other scholars. And I'm talking here mainly about when you're talking about human beings. But it applies somewhat to the creative works of human beings. That these things can be talked about in clear terms, but that one always makes an error when trying to pin them down in absolute terms, because someone will be able to find an example that doesn't fit your model.
So you can't basically make whatever definition you described as an absolute truth.
Exactly. Now, as I'm saying that, we talked last week about theory, and I noted that my overall perspective is post-structuralist. That is to say that there is truth, but it is not possible for any model to contain the complete truth of everything. So that is in part a starting assumption of mine. But even if you don't agree with that assumption, it's still generally good scholarship not to try and ascertain an absolute truth of something, because then any example that doesn't fit discredits everything you've done. If you are a little more modest in terms of your claims, then the validity of your work is actually stronger, because you're not attempting to extend it beyond the bounds of what you actually studied. For example, in terms of these issues of defining, I found that a lot more absolute definitions come from people with little scholarly background, or novice scholars, like sometimes graduate students, whereas more experienced scholars tend to be very careful about their claims and very thorough with their evidence. So, now how are we doing time-wise? Okay, we're almost out of time. We have a little time left. I think perhaps we should get back to writing field notes after I return. Field notes are something that are often useful in combination with interviewing, but are completely different in terms of what you do when you write field notes. And field notes are a more specialized anthropological technique that does not have nearly the breadth of applications that interviewing does. However, even if you do not write rigorous field notes, the concepts involved in taking field notes can be helpful, even if it's not going to wind up part of an academic study. So we'll come back to that in the future. Probably then, let's see, because this is the today's the 12th, right? So not on the 19th, but on the 28th, 27th. Anyway, our last meeting this month, we'll talk about field notes. And I will also make sure that anything that I think will be helpful to you folks as a cohort that I get out of my conference, that I bring that back to share. There's actually a pretty decent chance of it because it's an interdisciplinary conference. So, for example, I'm not going to a conference that's all about video games. I'm going to a conference that is looking at issues in terms of two different topics, one being how evil is conceptualized, depicted, etc., especially in new media, and the other being issues of freedom of speech and false speech, i.e. things like fake news. So there will probably be some things in the various talks that will be helpful, possibly even will be sources some of you may wind up citing or helping you find sources to cite for your review of literature. Any questions? Yeah.
Is there any finalized brief for this?
The answer is no, and what I am going to do is I'm going to look at essentially a sort of brief progress brief, because I'm not seeing. I was looking at it and I wasn't seeing any clear advantage beyond that didn't just make additional work in the old version of that brief. So I I'm not exactly sure yet, but basically what it may consist of is a super early look at the PGR1 and an attempt to complete a PGR1 for what may not be your topic whatsoever, but to look into all the things you will need for a successful PGR1. I think that's probably a better brief one. And I will attempt to have details about that when I get back.
And what would be the due date? Roughly?
That would, let's see, I would probably make sure I'd probably want to give you 2 weeks, so then it'd be mid-April. And then we'd get on to focusing on getting the actual PGR1 done. Because then I can give you feedback on your draft PGR1 that if you want to and feel ready to work on your actual topic is great, but if not, it could be on an arbitrary topic just to see what goes into.
So ultimately, our biggest assignment for this class for this semester is the PGR.
Yes. The goal of this class is to get you the tools and techniques and basically conceptually ready to write a strong PGR1 and then to write that PGR1 and have it done and ready to submit by the end of the semester.
If we wanted to start interviewing people at this point, is that okay?
Start interviewing?
Yeah.
No. So here's what you can do. You can start looking for people to interview, but any interviews you conduct before you get ethics approval cannot be used in your research. You cannot get ex post facto ethics approval. The ethics department is the department's not the right word for it, but ethics at AUT is strict about that. Yes.
Proposed to, I don't know, I'm so great I can talk to Michelle Obama. I DM'd her and she was ready to talk to me. Can I send her the message saying, hey, I want to interview you, I'll give you the details when?
Yes.
Okay.
You can go that far. You can arrange to interview people. Yeah.
Oh, I really hope. I mean, Obama's
And
sweet, so.
And remember, you don't need ethics approval to interview content specialists about, or sorry, topic area specialists about their expertise.
Say for like someone makes cakes on Instagram, I don't need the ethics approval. I can just
Yeah,
can I interview them now?
you potentially can. You just want to be really clear. You want to define your topic well enough that you can be confident that all you are doing is going to talk to them about their experience marketing their cake business through Instagram.
And we can kind of, when for myself, obviously, when I write a template up for how I want to interview, am I best off to show you that first, and you can not approve it because you have to, but
Right.
I can get that advice from you.
Yeah, if you are looking at writing an interview guides, or even an interview plan, you definitely want to get one of us to look at it. I'm happy to look at anything you create in the course of this class, but what you especially want is once you figure out who you'll be working with to get your advisor, the person who's actually going to see you through your master's thesis, to look at it.
How does that part of the process work?
It's so basically in the course of this semester, you all will have hopefully some idea already about what our areas are. It's not too early to contact Daryl, Philippa, or I and say, I'm thinking about this. Would you be comfortable being my supervisor for that topic? Something that we could probably do more with is making sure that there's a really specific place and opportunity for that, because it would only be in the most unusual of circumstances that we leave anyone without a supervisor. That's not the way we operate. But it might be the case, depending on exactly what you're looking at, that in some cases we might actually look for an external supervisor who has expertise that is more relevant to what you're doing, or conduct a co-supervision where, for example, one of us is there, say, for our expertise on new media, and someone else is there because you're dealing with a subject in new media that they know intimately and we don't. So that's something we've already done, for example.
So, for example, in my case, taking this outside paper, if I wanted, say, Daryl and Dave, the
What you'd want to do, and frankly, it might seem a little bit intimidating, but you shouldn't hesitate to do, is send an email to the both of them explaining where you are with your thesis idea and asking if they might be interested in co-advising you or if they think that's a good idea. I wish I could say that university instructors are always approachable. Uh, we're not always approachable, not all of us anyway. But just as a matter uh, of, of baseline professionalism, a helpful response to a question about supervision is something you should be able to expect from anyone at your institution. A helpful response might be, well, actually, for this project, you don't really need my expertise. You'd want to talk to someone in this field or at that school. But you shouldn't ever feel like you'll be offending anyone or overstepping by inquiring about that. At least not anyone that you either A, is in the program that you're taking, or B, that you've had some other contact as a student with, as in your case.
It was my understanding that you only had co-supervisors and a doctorate and a
Ah,
master's was one. So it's just
it,
in special cases.
it's in special cases. By default, you only have one for a master's, but the rules allow us to do co-supervisions when it's appropriate.
And you put that in your PGR one.
Yes.
So you
Yes.
sort out before you do that PGR.
Yeah. Yeah. Frankly, don't hesitate to either just contact, like via email, or come talk to us about supervisions, including, for example, I will tell you right now, I'm happy to talk to any of you during my office hours about which one of us might be most appropriate for you if you don't know where to start, or I hope you will all feel comfortable talking to me. If for example, you don't feel like you know one of us well enough, I'm happy to be a point of contact and to help smooth that process. That's one of the things that I'm here for.
I've actually seen the PGR9 document because I did a research paper 1 year back
Okay.
before I did this paper. It's quite extensive, like 50 pages long, I think.
The PGR9 can billow to a size of 50 or more pages. Ethics approval is a big deal and requires a lot of work, which means if you have an idea for something that might require ethics approval, you want to get started as soon as possible. And to try and ease any terror people might have, there are resources available to help us, but also other staff and faculty at the university who can help you get what you need. And 50 pages is not 50 pages of you writing a defense of. That's like documentation, like releases and things like that. And yeah, it can get pretty hairy.
Is it a,
But
sorry,
we,
is it a PGR9, like if I want to interview 4 16-year-olds who make cakes online, am I doing a PGR9 per person?
no,
For one
no.
holiday?
The PGR9 is one form, and that and all of its accompanying like releases and details. That's where you get up to like a PGR9 that might be 50 pages, but not like 4 50-page documents.
So it's like an umbrella for your thesis, the ethics umbrella.
Yes, yes. The PGR9 is one form, and the form itself is only a couple of pages long, but the things it can require can wind up generating a lot of paper. So I know that you may not feel entirely ready. You don't need to be entirely ready. Okay, you don't need to be ready at all in terms of your topic yet. But the further along you can get, the sooner you can get, the better. And frankly, then that'll also help us because if any of you are able to submit your PGR1s, let's say by late April, that leaves me and also Philippa and Daryl with more time after that to help people who aren't ready yet, and all of you will be fully supported. We are here for you. Yeah. So don't panic, but if you've got an idea, don't sit on it. Start talking to us about it as soon as you have an idea that you've got anything more than a single sentence worth to say about it. Okay. Any other questions before we wrap? Okay, hopefully this recording came out okay. I have been trying to maintain a volume level, frankly, above what is really needed for this size space. This is more like my full lecture hall voice than my, seminar voice. But I really want this video to come out okay. And hopefully we'll have better technology in place and be more confident of it by next time.
So all the videos now good?
Oh yeah, you came in late. There are videos uploaded as unlisted YouTube videos for the first 2 lectures, but at the moment they're pretty much useless because the sound balance is way too low. I need to take them into editing software and see if I can bring the volume up enough to make them
Yeah, you can just use something
audible.
like a page and just increase the volume.
Yeah, my concern is that the speaker on the computer over there might be weak enough that by the time I bring the volume up enough, background noise will be overwhelming. We'll see. I'll do what I can. Okay, so I'm going to stop recording now.